I don't know if any of you know much about Francis Adams, but you may have heard his name. He's someone who made a huge impact in his own lifetime. And I won't summarise any further. I'll just launch into who he is, and then I'll talk a little bit about his poetry, particularly the poetry of revolt, not just the flag, and then come back to how all this contributed to his lifelong project of writing a radical identity. And I'll just note that I've said writing a radical identity, not the radical identity, because there are quite a few potential roles that a middle-class poet might take in becoming a proponent of socialism or radicalism in the way that Francis Adams did. So, for those who haven't met Francis Adams before, he was the son of Andrew Leith Adams, a British Army surgeon of Scottish extraction, and his wife Bertha, a novelist who produced many novels, plays, stories and songs, and who also edited literary journals in London. So he came from an upper middle class, well-educated background. That's important to contextualising his later work from the point of view of the working class. Although he lived at the end of the Victorian period, Adams was a self-styled modern whose writings and passions were committed to finding new ways of living and of applying the new ideas of his time. He himself thought of a modern poet as bringing together three important strands of late 19th century life: socialism, science, particularly Darwinism, and art. And much of his work was engaged in reconciling the contradictions implied by the simultaneous commitment to socialist ideals and those of high culture. A restless, intelligent, articulate and charismatic young man by all accounts of his contemporaries, Adams left the aesthetic and social milieu of London and Paris in the 1880s to make a place for himself in the literary and social history of Australia, as the various colonies here contemplated their relationships with England and each other. So it's pre-Federation, of course. Despite the fact that he returned to England in 1890 and died only 3 years later, Adams represents a strain in Australian nationalistic writing that is usually associated with the legend of the 90s, and he actually had a hand in constructing the legend of the 90s too. His output was prodigious. He was a very young writer. He published 15 books and contributed endlessly to Australian journals and newspapers before his untimely death in 1893 at the age of 30. So 15 books plus the rest. I'll just give you a tiny bit of background. These, just to explain this slide first though, Francis Adams in Australia, 1884 to 1890, that's the time in Australia, of course, and that book, A Child of the Age, which appears in the middle of the slide, is his first published novel. It was first published as Lester, but it got rewritten and republished later in this rather gorgeous form by John Lane. And that connects to Francis Adams's life in London and his persona as a sort of wild child of fin de siècle England and Paris. His other book on this slide was one of his later publications, and it's a collection of essays called The Australians, Being Social Studies by Francis Adams. And I think it's important to note that he wrote across many genres, or, any type of novel you could think of, he probably had a go at: bushrangers, murder mysteries, Silver Fork, poetry that was high art and lyrical in its aspirations, poetry that was more like bush ballads, adopting the voice of the proletariat. But in everything he wrote, Adams was interested in social analysis. He was always interested in the way in which people were formed by their environments and the ways in which the world needed to be made a better place. So even a Silver Fork novel, which is one concerned with high society and posh people, drawing room manners, he would find a way to weave in social criticism and critique. Sorry. As I've mentioned, and I won't go into this in too much detail, he did have very interesting parents who prepared him for the life of the mind. He cut himself off from them as a very young man as part of his rebellion against society. It was rebellion against his parents as representatives of society as well. Although he always loved his father and was very idealistic about him. His mother working for upper class publications and writing novels that he regarded as frivolous. There's a whole other story there about how she was dismissed by other writers in Australia who heard him talk about her. She was a very successful novelist, more successful than Adams himself ever was. She was a journalist writing for Household Words, Dickens's paper, and she was the editor of the Kensington magazine. She outlived both her sons and her first husband, and I haven't put a picture up of Frances Adams's brother, Harry, but both Frances and Harry took after their father in having tuberculosis, and they were both born in different places, Frances in Malta, Harry in East Brunswick in Canada, because the father, Andrew, was an army surgeon, and for most of their childhood was being posted all over the world, India, Malta, Kashmir, Eastern Canada. He did retire in 1873 and moved to Ireland while his wife remained in London, and after his death in 1883 of pulmonary hemorrhage, tuberculosis, she, a year later, remarried a very handsome young schoolmaster who had been named by Andrew, the father of the boys, as the executor of his will. So he was clearly a family friend. Now, so the family's not a problem for Adams, except insofar as he needed to break away from what his parents represented. So I'll talk more about his socialism in the course of the paper. His schooling, which is the other relevant thing to mention, and is part of his peripatetic life as a young man. As a child, he was shunted around not only because of his father's postings, but because of a cholera outbreak in Malta, which meant that he was sent off away from his family to his grandparents in England. He went to various schools, a number of schools in England, eventually ending up at Darwin's old school, Shrewsbury. And I have to say that at that time, Shrewsbury wasn't very distinguished for its teaching of science at all. And Darwin always regarded himself as having become a scientist despite, rather than because of, the school he went to. It was distinguished for its teaching of the classics. Adams couldn't see the point of going to university to study more classics, which is basically, mid-19th century what going to university would have meant. Instead, he floated around Paris as a diplomatic attaché and failed to get a place in the public service either. After some kind of rift with his family that we don't know the details of, he took himself off to the Isle of Wight. Very balmy sort of climate in the south of England, where he worked as a school teacher while pursuing his real passion of writing. He started writing as a very young man, teenager, and his very first published poem that we know of was about Sir Philip Sidney, who was known for his chivalry and his chivalry towards the poor, towards a working class soldier who needed a drink of water. So I like to think that Adams had begun his project of looking out for those less well off at quite an early age. Whoops, don't want to do that just yet. He and his brother both married women from the working classes. Adams's wife, Helen, was the daughter of a cotton spinner. She seems to have been quite literate and educated. I'm not saying she was, way beneath him on the social scale. She wrote poetry and published in Australia. But he definitely chose someone who didn't come from his mother's world. And his brother did the same thing. He met his wife on the Isle of Wight in a boarding house, but when he set off for Australia, he left her behind. And she only followed him later. There's a whole story there. I'll refer you to the biography if you like gossip. Haven't got time now. But it was about the time, 1884, that Adams was diagnosed with tuberculosis, and it's always also that time that he joined the Socialist Federation in London. He travelled from the Isle of Wight up to London to attend meetings, and he became friendly with Frank Harris, who was a bit of a scoundrel, but very active in socialist and publishing circles. 1884, the year that I've mentioned as being like the year that made him, if you like. Radio National listeners will know what I'm talking about. It's a year in which Adams married, in which he joined the Socialist Federation and also the year in which the doctor advised a healthier climate. He wanted to migrate to Australia, not just for the climate though. He also was passionate about the idea that Australia could be a new part of the new world, could be a place where democracy and a much fairer social system could flourish. He came to Australia for 6 years. He did end up saying he was mind sick of Australia in 1890 and went back to London to see if he could have one last go at literary success there. But he never renounced his Australian identity as it had developed. He continued to write about Australia and to champion Australian values and issues as he saw them. The 6 years that he spent in Australia saw a major change in Adams's literary style and his professional practice. He adopted journalism, not just novels and lyric poetry, which is how he'd begun. But entering the world of journalism, he also became much more connected to a world of radical socialist publishing, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now, what I've got here is just a slide showing the size of the Eureka flag. It looms large in real life as well as in the story of Adams's radicalism. It doesn't loom that large in the story of his radicalism, only when you're invited to talk about it by the Eureka Centre. But yeah, it was a bit of a starting point. What I want to focus on though is the poem that already had mentioned, the Australian flag. Let me just contextualise this a little bit. So I mentioned that he was full of hope for a democratic future, and he used the flag to represent that kind of chance for a new life for himself, but also for the British race, if you like. The Australian flag, pure blue flag of heaven with your silver stars, not beside those crosses blood-stained torture bars. Of course, he's talking about the Union Jack here. Not beside the token the foul sea harlot gave, pure blue flag of heaven must you ever wave. I'll just say here that Adams is always interesting. He's not always good. He tends to get a little bit OTT with his rhetoric about England. So the foul sea harlot, of course, is the British Empire. No, but young, exultant, free from care and crime, free from the soulless, selfish England of this later time. No, but faithful, noble, rising from her grave, flag of light and liberty forever must you wave. So he wasn't the only Australian poet, of course, to celebrate the Southern Cross and the flag of Eureka as a potential new emblem for Australia, but he very clearly linked it to a rejection of what he saw as the corrupt old world of Britain and capitalism. Did I mention that he was a Marxist? He claimed to have read Marx in the original. Not sure if he knew enough German to do that, but he certainly could have read the French translation, which had appeared in the 1880s before he left England. The other poem that Adams wrote about the flag, and this is written for the Australian Labor Federation in the 1880s, whereas the Eureka flag, of course, dates back to the 1850s. And to people like Adams and Henry Lawson, it was a symbol. It was something that could be carried forward from the stories about the Eureka Rebellion. Fling Out the Flag is tied to the labour movement of the 1880s, and it was published in The Worker originally in 1890. Fling out the flag, let her flap and rise in the rush of the eager air, with the ring of the wild swan's wings as she soars from the swamp and her reedy lair. Fling out the flag, and let friend and foe behold, for gain or loss, the sign of our faith and the fight we fight, the stars of the Southern Cross. O blues for the sky that is fair for all, whoever, wherever he be, and silver's the light that shines on all for hope and for liberty. And that's the desire that burns in our hearts, forever quenchless and bright. And that's the sign of our flawless faith and the glorious fight we fight. What is the wealthiest land on earth if the millions suffer and cry, and all but the happy selfish few would fain curse God and die? What are the glorious arts as they sit and sing on their jewelled thrones, if their hands are wet with blood and their feet befouled with festering bones? What are the splendid sciences? Driving nature with a bit of steel, if only the rich can mount the car and the poor are dragged at the wheel. Wealth is a curse and art a mock and science worse than a lie, when they're but the gift of the greedy thieves, the leeches that suck men dry. So there's links here, not just to his own later radical verse in Songs of the Army of the Night, which I'm going to be talking about mainly after this, but also there's a touch of the Henry Lawsons in there. That indignation and the rhetoric of not just rejection, but hatred. There's a splendid hatred that Adams celebrated at times in different writers and which he embodied. I'll come back to that as part of his problem in being a middle-class intellectual. I just wanted to read you one more stanza of this, though, because one thing that Adams was pretty interesting on is the subject of gender, and he saw the Australian bush girls as being a really important sign of hope for the future because they were independent, because they weren't sort of sucked in by the cant and the morality that English girls were made to conform to. This is how he saw it. I mean, a lot of various Australian novelists like Mrs. Rosa Pratt had similar ideas in their fiction. As the sky above is fair for all, whoever, wherever he be, as the blessed stars on all shed their light of hope and of liberty, so let the earth, this fertile earth, this well-loved southern land, be fair to all, be free to all, from strand to shining strand. Let boy and girl and woman and man in it at least be sure that all can earn their daily bread with hearts as proud as pure. Let man and woman and girl and boy in it forever be heirs to the best this world can give, happy, fearless, and free. So it's a real exhortation and a prayer for socialist values, if you like. I've stuck in another little Ballarat mention here, the William Wallace statue in the Ballarat Gardens, which was part of the Stoddart acquisition of marbles for the gardens in the late 19th century, the 1880s. This one was installed in 1889, and it was important enough to Francis Adams to comment on it that he wrote a poem and then added it to a collection of verse that had originally been published 2 years earlier, Songs of the Army of the Night. I've had a protest from our reader about the use of Scotch in the first line, but I've found similar uses of Scotch instead of Scottish in other contemporary sources, so we'll just have to forgive Francis Adams that one. This is Scotch William Wallace. It was he who in dark hours first raised his face to see, who watched the English tyrant nobles spurn, steel-clad with iron hoofs the Scottish free. I won't read the whole thing, but the last stanza. O Wallace, peerless lover of thy land, we need thee still, thy moulding brain and hand. For us, thy poor, again, proud tyrants spurn. The robber rich, a yet more hateful band. Sorry, I made a mess of that because it's a bit messy anyway. But Wallace to Adams is the William Wallace of the film, rather than the William Wallace that was being celebrated by Adams's contemporaries. Adams anticipates, if you like, the more modern take on Wallace as being a hero of rebellion against the British and against tyrants, I think. So it's just interesting that Adams was, he wasn't in Ballarat, but he was aware of what was going on, and he seized on this opportunity to embody those values of socialism in another piece of commentary on art. Getting down to the nitty-gritty, though, of how he wrote his own radical identity. This is a poem from Songs of the Army of the Night, which I haven't really introduced properly. Songs of the Army of the Night was originally published in 1887/1888 by the Federal Steam and Printing Company in Sydney. Adams usually sent his books to the best publishers he could find. He's quite ambitious as a writer. In this case, he had it printed by a press that would print something for the labour movement. It wasn't necessarily making a bid for literary esteem or acclaim. It was something that he wanted to get out to his comrades, if you like. And this poem, which I don't want to read the whole of, but if you can just scan through it yourselves, you'll see it's written from the point of view of someone who's talking to the working class and asking them to believe that he's sincere, that he's not just writing down to them, talking down to them. He basically points out that he's sacrificed a lot and worked hard for the cause of labour, which is something he quite often mentions. He talks about losing his health, if you like, from working too hard for the establishment of the labour movement in London before he left England, and then later in Queensland when he was also helping with the industrial campaigns and political campaigns. He donated quite a lot of money, so he was always poor. If you only knew how gladly I've given it all these years, he says, the light of mine eyes, the heat of my lips, mine agonies, my yearning tears, the blood that drips, the brain that sears. Basically, he's given his hope, his youth, his manhood, his art, his passion, his truth. If you knew this, you wouldn't reject me. You wouldn't say, here's another writer using us as something to make a career on. If you knew me, you wouldn't reject me. Rather, you would not say, what have you to do with me? You would not turn away doubting and bitterly. But you would, the final stanza I'm up to, but you would take my hand with your hand, oh my brother, if you only knew. You would smile at me, you would understand, you would call me brother as I call you. So there's a real bid for solidarity there. Someone who spoke very well, was regarded as incredibly knowledgeable and well educated by his fellow writers, is trying to put all that aside and to speak directly to those who are suffering, those who he wants to help. He has another poem, which I won't read you now, or point to, from the point of view of a woman who visits the labour camp and has the same sort of problem that she's, the workers sort of go, what are you doing here? And she has to point out that women too are part of this struggle and have something to offer. So the reason I've put up a picture of the Chartist meeting, London in 1848, is because if we look at Adams's publication of Songs of the Army of the Night, it's an army of the night. It's a collection of poems that often, in the first part especially, endorse revolution and violence as a way to cleanse the old values of the old world. And when you think about what kinds of revolution were familiar to him and his readers, both in Australia and England, the British experience was not limited to the Chartist meetings of 1848, but relevant to this paper because quite a lot of the people at Eureka had Chartist backgrounds. But 1848 was the last sort of big revolution on British soil. In 1884, when Adams was joining the Socialist Federation and leaving England, there were bombings in London by Irish terrorists. There were bombings in Russia from anarchists. There was a wave of violence in the cities of Europe, which I think is just as relevant to Adams's work in Australia as it is to his work in Britain. Sorry, I'm skipping a lot here. But the Chartism and the Chartist meetings were something that sort of pointed out that people who had a really just reason to protest and who wanted the government to do something about their wages, their poverty, the laws that oppressed them, could be othered and seen as a threat. That any violence was bad and not justified. And Adams in his poetry tries to step outside that popular perception of revolution and say, just imagine if you were me, if you were suffering the things that my poor family are suffering. You too might want to burn something, break down some barricades. Okay. Sorry, I'm skipping a little quickly through some of this. So the Chartist background from England, but when he came to Australia, Adams was, as I said, a member of the Socialist Federation in Britain, but very keen to connect with socialists and radical thinkers in Australia. In fact, he met his second wife, Edith. You'll have to read the book if you want to know what happened to Helen, the first wife. He met her working in a socialist bookshop in Australia. He wrote a lot for the Boomerang, for the Bulletin, for the journals and periodicals that are well known as voices for republicanism and outlets for radical writers. And he was part of that resurgence of Australian, not resurgence, but the surge in Australian socialism in the 1880s and 90s. But it was growing in the 1880s with other writers like Henry Lawson. Okay. And Mary Gilmore, for that matter. What I want to tell you here is basically these are associations with the Australian press. Adams was very closely associated with William Lane, who later took a group to New Paraguay to form the New Australia colony. He was seen by William Lane and others as being someone who really spoke for Australia, a Queenslander specifically. And he was part of the socialist group that was collaborating with the trade unions in the 1880s, in all the colonies, but especially in Queensland, which is where he was based in the late 1880s. He's credited with having helped to form the Australian Labor Federation in 1887. He, in 1888, was part of a campaign for the election of Sir Thomas McIlwraith, who later turned out to be more conservative, but at the time his motto was Australia for the Australians, and that's something that Adams really wanted to get behind. He saw McIlwraith as part of this hope for the future. Importantly, though, he didn't see McIlwraith as being a William Wallace. He was someone who was much more part of the system, a capitalist. He thought that the workers and those who wanted to support workers' rights needed to be pragmatic and to work with the capitalists and the politicians. So there are two strands here. There's a revolutionary strand where blood and revolt are exciting and where a splendid foundation of hate is something that Adams prizes. And this other strand of pragmatism, which is more associated with the Fabians, who I'll come back to in a minute, is sort of the idea that you could approach the new world, the creation of a new world, through education, through the use of political representation, through the election of working men to Parliament. So I've given you here a sort of part of the introduction to Songs of the Army of the Night. When it was published, a lot of more conservative critics criticised the grammar and the spelling and tried not to mention the murder and the bloodshed. Others decried Adams's zeal as being a little bit too bloodthirsty. I'm not giving you any examples of the bloodthirstiness, but you can find Songs of the Army of the Night online if you want to see more of the poems. Adams himself said, "I make no apology for several poems in the first part which are fierce, which are even bloodthirsty. As I felt, I wrote," and this is him channeling the working classes, or the non-working classes, the unemployed. "As I felt, I wrote, and I will not lessen the truth of what inspired those feelings by eliminating or suppressing the record of them." He's claiming a real truth here for what is basically his imaginary reconstruction of what it might be to be one of the oppressed masses. "Rather, let me ask you, whoever you be, to imagine what the cause was, from the effect in one who was unhappily born and bred into the dominant class, that's himself, and whose chief care and joy in life was in the pursuit of a culture which draws back instinctively from the violent and the terrible." So he's acknowledging that he's been brought up genteelly, but the pressure of his feelings and his sense of injustice is such that he's had to put that genteel, peace-loving nature aside and extend himself out into the passionate world of hatred and revolution. He's angry with his country. "I will arraign my country in my day because their iniquity would not let me follow out the laws of my nature." Couldn't they just let me be peaceful, peace-loving? "The laws of my nature, which were for luminosity and quiet, for the wide and genial view. But no, they made me take arms against a sea of troubles, hoping only too often by opposing to end them." So he'd begun his literary career as an adult, a fan of Matthew Arnold, sweetness and light and reason being dominant values. He'd ended reading Marx and talking about ways in which of ways in which to reorganise society to end property and corruption. No, we make no apology for bloody sweat and for tears of fire wrung out of us in the Gethsemane and on the Calvary of our country. Having said that, that's the first part of Songs of the Army of the Night. And the fragmented nature of his radical identity, as he's been writing it all these years, comes out in the second part and the third part. The second part, he talks about his trip to Asia. One of the differences between him and William Lane, editor of the Boomerang, and Lane as a socialist, Lane was very anti-Chinese. He was sort of one of the worst of the white Australian anti-Chinese racists. Adams, on the other hand, said the only problem with the Chinese is that we can't compete. Sound familiar? He basically said, I've seen the slums of Europe and England and the vice and the corruption and the gambling and the filth of the slums. And I've been to parts of Asia where he went to China and Japan in 1887. And he said, I can tell you the Chinese are no worse than us. In fact, London's worse. So he was actually quite afraid of being cancelled for not endorsing the White Australia policy as wholeheartedly as he could have. It's a sort of reverse. Anyway, so in the second part, he has poems about Asia. The sight of the sin which England has committed not only against herself, against Ireland, against Scotland, William Wallace example, but against India, against China, against the sweetest and gentlest people in the earth, the Japanese. His anti-imperialism underlies what he's saying here about his impressions of travel. They might seem fairly touristic and harmless as you read them, but he's here trying to pull them into the bigger picture of his radical program. And then in the third part, which he doesn't go into a lot of detail on, but it's based in Australia, this is his hope for the future. There is neither ferocity nor bloodthirstiness. Its keynote is hope, hope that dreads but does not despair. And that's because he saw space, air, light, education, equality, the potential for the vote for all members of society as being things that might allow Australia to avoid revolution, to avoid the violence that he'd sort of indulged in. It's a lovely quote from the Grönlund, I'm just thinking how to pronounce it. One of Adams's favourite socialist writers was I can't find it. A chap called Grönlund, who basically said that action doesn't come from reason and light and argument. Action comes from feeling. And that idea that socialism needs passion and conviction in order to be acted upon, because it's not easy, even for whether you're part of the working class or part of the middle class that wants to support the poorer brothers. You need more than just ideas. You need more than socialist theories. You need what Adams, as I've mentioned before, calls a splendid foundation of hate or anger or indignation. Now, against that idea of indignation and revolt, I was going to, and because you must be sick of my voice by now, I was going to play you a little clip from the Fabian, from YouTube about the Fabian Society. But you can look this up for yourselves if you want to. It's basically explaining that the Fabian Society, which was also founded in 1884, which is a kind of annus mirabilis in England, George Bernard Shaw being one of the most famous founding members, Sydney and Beatrice Webb also being prominent members. The Fabian Society represented a kind of wolf in sheep's clothing approach to social change, and that's what their coat of arms is here in the middle of the slide. You see the poor sheep strapped on the back of the wolf. And that stained glass window, which Bernard Shaw commissioned and never paid for, but it's now installed in the London School of Economics where it belongs, founded by the Fabians. The picture there shows members of the Fabian Society in medieval garb hammering out the world on an anvil, reworking the world to make it a better place, which is the most bloodthirsty that it could get, I think, for most of the Fabian Society. They tended to go in more for studies of poverty. The wife of the New Zealand commissioner in London, for instance, did a survey of housewives and how they managed on their budgets and helped to train people to, sort of deal better with poverty. So it was more ameliorating the status quo than overthrowing it. And as I said, the little explainer, which is in an AI voice, and I don't really regret not playing it, might be worth a look anyway. So, coming back to where we began, the picture of Francis Adams, the dilemma of the middle-class radical, the ideas that socialism, science and art were the major aspects of modernity that he was interested in, but which he had to find ways of reconciling, find ways of working with. And in the end, he insisted that science and art had to be in the service of socialism in order to make the world a better place, but in order to justify the existence of the artist as well. It's a poem I haven't given you the text of in the slides. Again, it's easy to find. It's called Art, I think. It's in Songs of the Army of the Night. And it's one of his better poems. I sort of feel a bit sheepish with a lot of his poetry, but this one I think is very clear and very effective in what it's saying. Yes, let art go, if it must be that with it men must starve. If music, painting, poetry spring from the wasted hearth, pluck out the flower, however fair, whose beauty cannot bloom, how sweet it be, or however sweet it be or rare, saved from a noisome tomb. These social manners, charm and ease, are hideous to he who knows the degradation, the disease from which their beauty grows. So poet must thy singing be, O painter, so thy scene, musician, so thy melody, while misery is queen. Nay, brothers, sing us battle songs with clear and ringing rhyme. Nay, show the world its hateful wrongs and bring the better time. So that's in italics and a sort of strong exhortation at the end of the poem. And there's a clear prioritising of social values over art. This may not be the only answer to the question of how the middle-class intellectual can become a socialist spokesperson and artist, but it does seem to have been the one by which Adams most consistently acted and which he used most in his writing of a radical identity for himself. In his later work, the early disciple of Matthew Arnold would give his allegiance to the cause of humanity over the cause of art. It was that political and social idealism that earned him a place as something more than a minor poet, novelist or literary critic, both in his own time and in history, but which earned him a place in social history and in cultural history of Australia, as well as the English-speaking world. Big claim.